Chapter 1. Edge of the World. In the middle of the southeastern Pacific Ocean, over 3,500 kilometers from the Chilean coast, and more than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest inhabited island, a triangle of dark volcanic rock rises from the sea. This tiny speck of land is known to most of the world as Easter Island, but to its people, it has another name: Rapa Nui. Here, nearly 900 massive stone figures, the Moai, stand watch over windswept plains and crashing waves. They stare inland, not out to the ocean, as if guarding the people rather than warning of invaders. Each statue can weigh many tons and tower several meters high. They are at once majestic and unsettling, relics of a society that transformed an isolated island into a gigantic, sacred landscape. For centuries, outsiders have asked the same questions. Who built these giants? How were they carved and moved? Did their creators destroy the island's environment and doom themselves to collapse? And what secrets are still hidden beneath the soil and behind the unreadable signs of the island's mysterious script? Today, using the latest research in archaeology, genetics, and environmental science, we'll explore Rapa Nui from its volcanic birth to its uncertain future. We'll see how new evidence is overturning the old story of ecocide and revealing a people far more resilient, ingenious, and connected than once believed. This is not just the story of a remote island. It's a mirror held up to our own world. How human communities shape their environment, build monuments to memory, face catastrophe, and fight to protect their heritage in the age of climate change. Chapter 2. Fire in the Sea: The Island's Birth and Landscape. To understand the people of Rapa Nui, we first need to understand the island itself. Easter Island is the summit of a volcanic mountain rising from the ocean floor. It was built by eruptions from several main volcanoes, Teravaca, Poike, and Rano Kau, that slowly created a triangular island roughly 24 kilometers long. Their craters, some now filled with freshwater lakes, still dominate the skyline. The climate is subtropical, but not lush like a tropical rainforest. Rapa Nui is windy, with limited freshwater sources and thin soils formed on volcanic rock. In ancient times, the island was covered by a mix of forest and shrubland, including a now extinct palm species, along with the toromiro tree, a small legume that once played an important role in local ecology and culture and is now being carefully reintroduced. The surrounding ocean, however, is rich. The Rapa Nui people developed sophisticated fishing strategies using canoes, stone fish traps, and nearshore reefs. Recent archaeological work suggests that marine resources, fish, shellfish, and even deep water species, were central to the island's long-term survival, especially as forests declined. From above, the island looks like a natural fortress: steep cliffs, pounding waves, and no naturally safe harbor. It is both isolated and self-contained, a perfect laboratory for studying what humans do when they must make a small, finite world work for centuries. Chapter 3. Across the Empty Ocean: First Settlers. Long before Europeans gave the island its Easter Sunday name in 1722, Polynesian navigators had already crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean to reach it. Using stars, ocean swells, winds, and even the flight paths of birds, they sailed double-hulled canoes carrying families, animals, and crops. Rapa Nui lies at the far eastern edge of the Polynesian world, an extreme outpost that shows just how bold and skilled these voyagers were. For many years, scholars argued over when the first canoes arrived. Older interpretations suggested settlement as early as around 800 CE, but more recent radiocarbon dating of charcoal food remains, and early habitation layers points to a later colonization, around the 12th or 13th century. These early settlers brought with them the signature plants and animals of Polynesian expansion: sweet potatoes, taro and yams, chickens and possibly rats, techniques for gardening in poor soils and using stone mulch to conserve water. On Rapa Nui, they adapted these traditions to an island with no large rivers, limited wood, and variable rainfall. Over generations, the community grew, organized into extended families and clans, each claiming territory around the island. Modern research shows that Rapa Nui was not as completely cut off as once thought. Architectural and ritual similarities between Rapa Nui and other Polynesian islands suggest connections and shared ideas across the Pacific, even after the island was settled. Chapter 4. The People of the Moai: Society and Belief. By the time European explorers first saw Rapa Nui, the island's society was already many centuries old. The people who called themselves Rapa Nui spoke a Polynesian language, cultivated gardens in stone-lined fields, and organized themselves into complex social groups. The island was divided among clans, each associated with certain lineages and territories. At the top of this social order were chiefly families who claimed descent from founding ancestors. Authority was not based on written laws, but on genealogy, ritual prestige, and the ability to mobilize labor for large projects, especially the building of moai and the platforms they stood on, called ahu. Religion centered around ancestor veneration. The moai were not gods in the Western sense. They were embodiments of powerful ancestors, chiefs, and important figures. Erecting a statue on an ahu platform, overlooking a clan's land, was a way to anchor that ancestor's presence and mana, spiritual power, in the landscape. The statues facing inland symbolized protection and blessing for the living community. Over time, each clan invested tremendous effort into these ancestral monuments. New moai were carved, older ones replaced or enlarged. The platforms themselves were carefully engineered, with fitted stonework and sometimes buried chambers. Rituals of dedication, offerings, and feasting reinforced the bond between people and their watchful stone ancestors. Rapa Nui society was dynamic, not static. Competition between clans may have driven innovation. Bigger or more numerous moai signaled prestige, just as large temples did in other parts of the world. Recent 3D mapping of the main quarry even suggests that statues were carved in multiple separate workshops, each using slightly different techniques, possibly corresponding to different clans. Chapter 5. Quarries of Giants: Carving the Moai. The heart of the Moai world lies on the slopes of an extinct volcano, Rano Raraku. Here, in a soft volcanic rock called tuff, carvers sculpted hundreds of statues directly out of the mountainside. Almost half of all known moai remain in and around this quarry, some still attached to the rock, frozen mid-creation. Craftsmen first outlined the statue on the rock face, carving the head and torso lying on its back. They worked with stone tools made from harder basalt, thousands of which have been found scattered around the quarry. After shaping the front, they undercut the statue until it could be detached, sliding it down the slope to be transported across the island. Moai vary greatly in size. Some are only a couple of meters tall. Others reach over 10 meters, and one unfinished giant in the quarry would have been more than 20 meters high if completed. Most were carved between roughly the 10th and 16th centuries, as stylistic changes show evolving artistic traditions over time. Recent high-resolution drone surveys and 3D modeling of Rano Raraku have revealed clusters of statues that seem to have been carved in distinct zones, each with slightly different proportions and details. Some researchers interpret this as evidence that different clans or specialist teams had their own areas and carving styles, supporting the idea of a decentralized, cooperative system, rather than a single authoritarian ruler commanding the entire island. Once a statue reached its destination, it was erected on an ahu platform. In some cases, cylindrical red stone hats called pukao, carved from a different quarry, were placed on the statue's heads. Coral and obsidian were inset into eye sockets to create a striking, almost lifelike gaze during ceremonies. Standing in front of these giants today, it's easy to forget that every surface, every subtle curve of the nose and jaw was carved by human hands.
Chapter 6. Walking Stone. Moving the Moai. If carving the Moai was a feat of artistry, moving them was an engineering miracle. For a long time, scholars imagined that the statues were dragged on wooden sledges or rolled on logs, which seemed to fit with tales of deforestation. But that idea raised problems. The island did not have a limitless supply of large trees, and the logistics of laying long tracks of logs across rough terrain were daunting. Local oral traditions, however, spoke of the statues walking to their places with the help of people and manna. In the last few decades, experimental archaeologists have taken those stories seriously. By building replica statues and pulling them with carefully coordinated ropes, they showed that a small team can rock a statue from side to side, slowly walking it forward. No logs required. In this method, two teams stand on either side of the statue, pulling alternately to pivot it. A third team behind keeps it from tipping. With the right rhythm, the statue advances step by step. The chipped bases of some ancient moai, worn at angles consistent with this movement, support the idea that many were transported upright. This doesn't mean every statue was moved in exactly the same way. Terrain, distance, and statue size likely affected techniques, but it shows that Rapa Nui engineers could use clever physics and cooperative labor rather than massive timber consumption to build their sacred landscape. The image of stone giants walking across the island is not just poetic. It's a glimpse of how ancestral knowledge, ritual chants, and practical engineering may have intertwined in the daily life of Rapa Nui.
Chapter 7. Collapse or Resilience? Rethinking the ecocide myth. For many years, a dramatic story dominated popular accounts of Rapa Nui: the ecocide myth. According to this version, the islanders cut down all their trees to move statues, destroyed their environment, triggered famine and warfare, and nearly wiped themselves out long before Europeans arrived. This story was popularized in books and documentaries as a warning for our modern world. But recent research paints a more nuanced and, in some ways, more hopeful picture. Yes, the environment changed. Pollen records show that the once forested island gradually shifted to grasslands. Human activity, including clearing land for gardens and using wood, played a role. Rats brought by canoes may also have prevented the regeneration of the native palms by eating their seeds. However, new archaeological and genetic studies suggest that the Rapa Nui people did not simply crash into oblivion. Instead, they adapted. They developed intensive gardening systems using stone mulching to capture moisture, built manavai, stone-walled garden enclosures, to protect plants, and increasingly relied on marine resources. A large study of ancient and modern Rapa Nui genomes, published in 2024, found no clear evidence of a massive pre-European population collapse. Rather, the population appears relatively stable until the catastrophic arrival of outsiders in the 18th and 19th centuries. Archaeologists also note that the construction and use of ahu and moai continued even after European contact, contradicting the idea of an earlier, complete social collapse. Overall, the new view is that Rapa Nui's people showed remarkable resilience, adjusting to environmental stress instead of simply self-destructing. The lesson is still powerful, but different. It's not only a warning about overuse of resources, it's also a story about human creativity, cooperation, and survival on a small, finite planet. Chapter 8. Contact and Catastrophe. Europeans arrive. The true catastrophe for Rapa Nui did not come from Moai or gardens. It came from beyond the horizon. On Easter Sunday, 1722, Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen sighted the island and gave it the name Pasch Island, Easter Island. He described a landscape dotted with statues and a population estimated at a few thousand people. Later visits by Spanish and British expeditions in the 18th century reported similar numbers, suggesting a stable community, not a population already ruined. But contact opened the door to violence and disease. Ships brought epidemics of smallpox and other illnesses. In the 19th century, Peruvian slave raiders carried away a large portion of the island's population to work in mines and plantations. Many died, and only a handful were ever returned, bringing new diseases back with them. Missionaries arrived, converting many islanders to Christianity and suppressing traditional practices. The Moai were toppled, partly as a result of internal conflicts and partly under the influence of changing beliefs and colonial pressures. New economic systems and land claims disrupted traditional ways of organizing society. By the late 19th century, Rapa Nui's population had fallen to only a few hundred survivors. Chile annexed the island in 1888, and for decades, much of the land was leased to sheep ranching companies, while the island's indigenous inhabitants were confined to a small area near the main settlement. So while the island's environment did face serious human impacts over time, the sharpest collapse in population and culture came from colonization, slavery, and disease, forces imposed from outside. Chapter 9. Lost Words and Hidden Journeys. Rongo Rongo and DNA. Among Rapa Nui's many mysteries, one stands apart. Rongo Rongo, an undeciphered system of glyphs carved into wooden tablets and other objects. Fewer than 30 authentic pieces are known to exist today, scattered in museums around the world. For a long time, there was debate about whether Rongo Rongo developed before or after European contact. Some even suggested it might have been inspired by Western writing. But recent radiocarbon dating of several tablets shows that the wood they're carved on dates to around the 15th century, well before Europeans reached the island. This strongly supports the idea that Rapa Nui invented its own script independently, one of the few cases of independent writing invention in human history. Despite decades of effort, no one has definitively decoded Rongo Rongo. Researchers work with digital photographs, tracings, and statistical analyses, looking for patterns that might reveal whether it encodes language, ritual sequences, genealogies, or something else. The devastating loss of native scribes during the colonial period means that living knowledge of the script vanished before it could be recorded. Modern genetic studies are revealing other secrets. By analyzing DNA from ancient remains and modern inhabitants with Rapa Nui ancestry, scientists have found evidence of limited Native American gene flow into the population centuries ago. The most likely explanation is contact between Polynesians and indigenous peoples from South America, sometime around the 12th to 13th centuries. perhaps through voyaging or intermarriage after long-distance journeys. This doesn't mean frequent traffic between continents, but it does show that Rapa Nui was part of a web of occasional, long-range contacts across the Pacific. A reminder that the ocean was a highway, not a barrier for skilled navigators.
Chapter 10. Rapa Nui. Today, heritage, climate, and the future. Today, Rapa Nui is a special territory of Chile, but it is also recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, with much of the island protected as Rapa Nui National Park. Tourism is now the main economic engine, drawing visitors from around the world to see the Moai, volcanic craters, and archaeological sites. The Rapa Nui people continue to fight for cultural and political autonomy. There has been a strong movement to revive the Rapa Nui language, traditional arts, dances, and crafts. Festivals, music, and educational programs help younger generations reconnect with their ancestors' heritage. At the same time, new threats loom. Rising sea levels and more powerful storms linked to climate change are eroding coastal sites, including some of the most famous Ahu and Moai. A recent study warned that the iconic alignment of 15 statues at Ahu Tongariki, along with dozens of other cultural sites, could face serious wave damage by 2080 if sea levels continue to rise. Conservationists and local authorities are debating how to respond, whether to reinforce coasts, relocate vulnerable statues, or adapt visitor access to protect fragile landscapes. Every choice involves balancing spiritual significance, scientific value, and practical realities. At the same time, efforts are underway to restore parts of the island's lost ecology. The Toromiro tree, extinct in the wild since the mid-20th century, is at the center of a reintroduction project involving local families and scientists. Carefully inoculated seedlings are being planted in sheltered spots, with the hope that this once sacred tree can thrive again. Rapa Nui has moved from being seen as a cautionary tale of self-destruction to a more complex story. A resilient community facing new global pressures, trying to control its destiny in a world that once nearly erased it. Epilogue. Lessons from the Stone Giants. Standing before a Moai at dusk, with the wind pulling at your clothes and the Pacific stretching to the horizon, you can feel how small you are, and how powerful human stories can be. The people of Rapa Nui carved immense ancestors from volcanic rock, moved them across an unforgiving landscape, and arranged them in a network of sacred places that turned an entire island into a memorial. They faced environmental change, social tension, and devastating outside invasions. But they did not simply destroy themselves in a mindless frenzy of statue building. Instead, they adapted, survived, and continue to reshape their future today. The Moai are not just relics. They are messages from the past about memory, identity, and responsibility. In their silent gaze, we can see questions we still struggle with. How do we honor our ancestors without sacrificing our descendants? How do we live within the limits of our environment without losing our dreams? How do small communities defend their culture in a world of massive forces? Easter Island, Rapa Nui, is still at the edge of the world. But thanks to the work of archaeologists, geneticists, local elders, and cultural leaders, its story is no longer a simple myth of collapse. It is a living conversation between stone, sea, and people. And as we face our own global challenges, perhaps the greatest secret of the stone giants is this. On a small island in a vast ocean, humans survived not just by building monuments, but by learning, adapting, and remembering
who they are.